At the beginning of the 3rd century AD, 4 great empires dominated Eurasia. In the west was the Roman Empire. Beside it, extending from Mesopotamia into Central Asia, was the Parthian Empire. The Kushan Empire rules northern India in a broad region beyond the Himalayas, where its borders met the western protectorates of Han Dynasty China. All 4 states seemed relatively stable. The Roman Empire was prosperous and aggressive, its military larger than ever before. Although the Parthians had suffered a series of defeats, they retained more or less the same borders they had defended since the great Roman conquests of the late Republic. The Kushan realm seemed secure, and the Han Dynasty, though riven by rebellion and gradually receding from its conquests in the Tarim Basin, still governed virtually all of its traditional domains. A half-century later, the world had changed. The Roman Empire was torn by civil war and battered by invasions. The Parthians were gone, replaced by a new dynasty. The Kushan Empire had withdrawn to India. China was divided between 3 warring kingdoms. What had happened? Why had all 4 of Eurasia's great empires collapsed or declined in the same relatively short period? Was this coincidental or spurred by some underlying cause? Let's start by taking a closer look at what happened to each of our 4 empires. In the early 3rd century, Rome was governed, with one brief interruption, by members of the Severan dynasty. Besides Septimius Severus, the founder, none were especially effective rulers, and one, Elagabalus, has a fair claim to be the most wildly incompetent emperor in Roman history. But under their tenure, the empire was generally stable. Although there were signs of the trouble to come in the steady debasement of the currency and chronic problems along the northern and eastern frontiers, the provincial cities and their elites were broadly unaffected. The half-century that followed the end of the Severan dynasty is often described as the crisis, or anarchy. Emperor after emperor was proclaimed by the legions, none lasting long enough to establish a dynasty. Civil wars tore through almost every province. Barbarians swept repeatedly over the frontiers. And in the east, the Parthians were replaced by a dynamic new dynasty. The Parthian Empire was ruled by a king of kings, much of whose authority was devolved to local dynasts. Thanks to vigorous polygamy, almost every Parthian ruler produced a large brood of potential heirs, which set the stage for chronic dynastic struggles. Equally chronic were pressures on the frontiers, both from steppe nomads and the Romans in Syria. The Romans were especially successful during the 2nd century, when they repeatedly sacked the Parthian capital. In 217, the Parthians were able to fight off a Roman invasion and demand tribute from their rivals. But only a few years later, the king of kings Artabanus IV was forced to confront a rebellious local dynast named Ardashir. A battle was fought, Artabanus fell, and the Parthian dynasty died with him. Ardashir had himself crowned king of kings in 226, inaugurating the Sasanian dynasty, and, soon after, a new series of Roman-Persian wars. We know little about Kushan history. Their decline in the mid-3rd century, however, seems to have been at least partially driven by the Sasanians, who conquered Kushan territories west of the Indus River. After these campaigns, the Kushans withdrew to the southeast, where their control would endure until the rise of the Gupta dynasty. The Han dynasty, finally, declined and fell for reasons that had nothing to do with their western neighbors. The seeds of collapse had been planted centuries before, when Emperor Guangwu, restoring dynastic control after the traumatic rebellion of Wang Mang, established a regime that encouraged local landlords to become increasingly powerful and allowed the imperial court to become progressively more remote. A series of disasters in the late 2nd century, most famously the Yellow Turban Rebellion, combined with a series of weak or underage emperors, often controlled by court factions, to create a power vacuum exploited by a generation of overmighty generals. We'll explore the connections between these stories of imperial collapse after a brief word about this video's sponsor. Within a generation, according to Bloomberg analysts, more than 62% of America's wealth will belong to the richest 1%, far more than ever before. By comparison, the median annual income is expected to remain almost static. Facing this uncertain future, wealthy investors are pouring money into the art market. Today's sponsor, Masterworks, gives middle-income investors a chance to potentially insulate their wealth from volatility with million-dollar, blue-chip, investment-grade art. They have delivered on 15 exits, all of them profitable for their investors. This, of course, does not guarantee future performance, but it's easy to see why nearly 800,000 people have signed up so far. And since so many of you seem to be interested, Masterworks is extending your chance to skip the waitlist. To get started, all you have to do is click the link in the description. See important disclosures at masterworks.com/about/disclosure. Returning to our topic, there are interconnections between the declines of Eurasia's four empires, at least to the extent that the rise of the Sasanians destabilized both the Roman and the Kushan empires. But none of the empires can be said to have been responsible for what happened to the others. If there are any common threads in these stories, they have to be sought in the underlying factors of climate and disease. In the Roman Empire, the first, and at least part of the 2nd century, were characterized by exceptionally warm and stable weather, the so-called Roman climatic optimum. Weather in the 3rd century seems to have been generally cooler and more variable. It is possible, but by no means certain, that Rome's neighbors experienced similar conditions. Even where we have good proxies for climate change, via tree rings, pollen deposits, or ice cores, we have to be careful about how we interpret them, since changes in the climate of one region do not guarantee shifts in another. Recent research suggests that the Roman climatic optimum was a regional phenomenon. Even when the Mediterranean was at its balmiest, in other words, other parts of Eurasia may have been no warmer than usual. And when the Roman climate became less stable in the 3rd century, there is no reason to assume that similar changes took place in China or Parthia. Nor is there any evidence in this period for an eruption massive enough to cause global cooling. Droughts in Central Asia are sometimes theorized to have spurred the movement of the Huns into Europe, and thus the barbarian invasions of the 5th century. This may have been so, but there is no evidence for a similar chain reaction in the 3rd century, when steppe nomads were incidental to the problems of Eurasia's empires. The Antonine Plague, possibly an ancestor of smallpox, ravaged the Roman and Parthian empires during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. To judge from the popularity of the so-called smallpox goddess in northwestern India around this time, it reached the Kushan kingdom. Chinese sources also mention pestilence in this era, but after a flare-up in 190 to 91 that was apparently confined to the Roman Empire, the Antonine Plague seems to have vanished, a full generation, that is, before the crises of the early 3rd century. The mysterious plague of Cyprian appeared in Roman Africa in 249 and spread widely through the empire. This, however, was decades after the period we're discussing. It is possible that less stable weather contributed to the problems experienced by Eurasia's empires during the 3rd century. It is also possible that the lingering effects of the Antonine Plague weakened one or all. But it is equally likely, especially given the limited nature of our evidence, that neither climate nor plague played any substantial role, and that the decline of all four states can be explained in purely political and social terms. For deeper discussion of the complex relationships between climate, disease, and history, I invite you to watch my interview with Kyle Harper, whose book, The Fate of Rome, explores how environmental factors may have contributed to the Roman Empire's collapse. I have a new book, Insane Emperors, Sunken Cities, and Earthquake Machines, More Frequently Asked Questions about the Ancient Greeks and Romans. It's a sequel to Naked Statues, Fat Gladiators, and War Elephants, and it's available for pre-order now on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and through your local bookstore. If you're interested in more Told in Stone content, including my podcast, check out my channel, Told in Stone Footnotes. I also have a channel called Scenic Routes to the Past, which is dedicated to historically themed travel. You'll find both channels linked in the description. Last but not least, please consider joining other viewers in supporting Told in Stone on Patreon. Thanks for watching.